right, good evening and welcome to the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio and I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. Tonight we are so happy to welcome historian and author Michael Hattem to present An Unfinished Revolution at 250. Hattem will discuss the unique role that the revolution has had in American life and the long-standing tradition in American history of remembering the nation's founding as an unfinished revolution. Hattem is an American historian with interests in early America, the American Revolution, and historical memory. His lecture will be based on his book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, Yale University Press, 2024, which was a finalist for the 2025 George Washington Prize, and we have some downstairs if you would like to purchase one. Hattem notes that the principles of the revolution have been constantly redefined to fit the needs of the times. Countless social movements, including abolitionists, suffragists, and the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s, have tried to win popular support by depicting their causes as attempts to fulfill the ideals of the American Revolution, he says. He explains that abolitionists were the first Americans to celebrate the Declaration of Independence, specifically for its preamble and the statement that all men are created equal. While sharing his hope that visitors gain an understanding that the 250th anniversary offers an opportunity to redefine those principles for our own times, Hattem adds, as we commemorate the anniversary of American independence, this long and surprising history serves as a critical reminder of the importance of redefining the revolution in ways that are meaningful and useful in the present. This event is part of NH250, an ongoing series of programming developed by the New Haven Museum to complement America 250. Culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the series will highlight inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting past and present. Michael Hattem received his PhD in history at Yale University and has taught at the New School and Knox College. He previously published Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. He is currently the Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. His work has been featured or mentioned in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Smithsonian Magazine, and Washington Post, among others. He has served as a historical consultant or contributor for numerous projects and organizations, curated historical exhibitions, appeared in television documentaries, and authenticated and written catalog essays for historical document auctions. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to begin with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine around the turn of the 19th century. And in January 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg Wadsworth, who was a former Continental Army officer and who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, if he could get her a memento of the revolutionary hero. Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name, she wrote in a letter to her father. But then she went a step further and asked, had he hair? Well, Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. And 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, who was the Washington's personal secretary. And in it, there was a letter in which Lear wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair I have the honor now to enclose." So shortly after, Eliza receives a package in the mail from her father, and inside were 2 envelopes, and one of them is marked, "Read this first." So she opens that, and in there is a letter from Peleg, and it read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington. I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." And then Eliza described what happened next. She wrote, "I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. Imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor this relic, she wrote. I feel as if it was too great for me to possess, and I want to give thousands who have never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy, she wrote. But Eliza's health was quite unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note leaving her most prized possession, this lock of hair, in the care of her sister, Zilpa. Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and this lock of hair were preserved within the family, and her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Now, Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman in a lock of hair. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection that Americans have developed to the memory of the Revolution beginning in the early 19th century. And so I'm going to begin my talk tonight by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with the Revolution, with their founding, and what it actually means that we have mythologized the Revolution, and to show you something about how that has worked in practice. Now, the memory of the American Revolution, how we remember the Revolution, is essentially our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception, right, or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of an origin myth is to tell a story and explain how a society or a people came to be, and to go some way towards defining that society's character and its core principles. And so then to mythologize the Revolution is not to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but it is to tell the story of the Revolution specifically for the purpose of explaining how the United States came to be, and to tell that story in a way that helps to define its character and principles. Now, myths are first and foremost stories, right? And like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act has typically focused on the coming of the Revolution. If we think of famous legislation and events like the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, all the way up to independence. The second act has typically featured the war, right? And this is a sort of a succession of famous battles. If we think of the Battle of Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. And then the third and final act has typically recounted how, in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention, and ultimately the culmination of the Revolution with the Constitution. And this, this story structure has a very logical beginning, middle, and end. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way that Americans have told this basic story of the Revolution has actually followed a familiar form. So this is the hero's journey. It is a common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that Campbell found in his study of many hero myths from around the world. Now, in the 20th and the 21st centuries, this story structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell and his work, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I'm going to suggest to you tonight that how we have told the story of the American Revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, the hero, or let's say in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. Now, after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over the colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party, and this leads to the creation of a Continental Congress. Now, in the story, the hero typically, or at least initially, resists the call to adventure, and throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence, right? And instead focuses on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And of course, in July 1776, we can say that the revolutionaries accepted the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. Now, the hero then undergoes a series of challenges and temptations. And for the revolution, these challenges and trials are represented by many of the war's battles. And if we think about some of the most famous stories from the Revolutionary War, even though they're rooted in actual history, they have come to feature in their telling and their retelling mythical themes and near mythological scenarios. So, for example, if we think about the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, right, when the army is penned in along the East River and George Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under cover of darkness and a very opportune fog. If we think about the Battle of Trenton, the attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, right? This is Emanuel Lewitz's famous painting of the crossing of the Delaware. Washington crosses the Delaware with his ragtag army, right, and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians just days before the army's enlistments are about to end. And though these stories are rooted in actual historical events, they've been told and retold in ways that have lent them near mythical connotations. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor, and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And just like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible in 1781. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, we might think of the revelation of having secured independence following the war, leading the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And then once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, and they return to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero's adventure. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us, even when it's not explicit. We are sort of culturally hardwired, in a sense, in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses in people. And we can actually see this in a field of study known as fandom studies. And fandom studies explores how people and groups relate to these kinds of stories and other facets of popular culture, how people express their emotional connections to these kinds of stories, and how they go on to influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with fellow fans. So one of the most common ways that fans do these things is through conventions, right? Annual events where people who share a love of these stories gather to discuss and express their connections to them. We might think of our July 4th gatherings every year as being very similar to these conventions. Another way that fans express their emotional connection to these kinds of stories is by engaging in cosplay, right, where they dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, we have a long tradition of reenacting Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware in full costume. Another way that fans express their emotional connections to stories is through fan fiction, right, where they write stories featuring the characters of their favorite stories. And of course, we have done this by creating and reading historical fiction, right? That is stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real-life characters. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, where they create artwork that depicts their favorite characters and favorite scenes from their stories. And we might think of John Trumbull's work and Emanuel Lewitz's famous painting as fan art of the American Revolution, right? Because both of those artists are trying to convey to the public an emotional connection that they have to the event that they are depicting. And then there is one final way I'll mention that fans engage with their stories is by visiting recreations of the world of their stories, right? So if you're a fan of Harry Potter, you can go to Universal Studios and walk down Diagon Alley. If you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings, you can go to New Zealand and visit the Shire. And people visit these places because they want to inhabit the stories that they have such a deep emotional connection to, because it strengthens their connection to those stories and to the community of their fellow fans. And this is the same reason why Americans have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg, right, and the Boston Freedom Trail and Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the Revolution have similarities to these fan cultures. And the reason for that, I think, is because we have often told the story of the Revolution in a similar manner to these kinds of stories that prompt the creation of these fan cultures, right? Fan groups are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations, and they establish such a deep emotional connection to that story that they go on to form a part of their personal identity, and it leads them to create a community with fellow fans. And so I think that so at the heart of our relationship to the Revolution is something really elemental about how we as humans relate to these kinds of stories and the effects that they have on us. And so I would suggest to you that no small part of the power of the memory of the Revolution comes from the fact that it is an origin myth that we have told in the form of a hero myth, right? And I think that understanding the form in which we have told the story actually helps us to better understand this sort of unique emotional connection that Americans have had to the Revolution for the last 250 years. Now, it is also important, though, to point out that even within the general structure that I've laid out here, let's say the hero's journey structure, we have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the story of the Revolution. And that's essentially what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling a story about the past to attribute specific meanings to it. And as my book shows, we have interpreted the Revolution and its meaning in many, many different and often directly conflicting ways over the last 250 years. And that actually should not be surprising, because the founding generation themselves never agreed on what the Revolution meant or what its principles were. And so, in other words, there is no single correct interpretation or meaning of the Revolution. As a national origin myth, the memory of the Revolution has been constantly contested over the last 250 years and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to the revolution typically reveal far more about the present than the past. They reveal far more about us than the revolution. And I argue in the book that essentially the revolution has provided us with a sort of shared political language. You know, if we think of terms and ideas like liberty, equality, tyranny, resistance, consent of the governed, constitution, democracy, you can't use any of these terms without in some way, without having some kind of connotation that goes back to the revolution. And just like any language, the meaning of these words can change over time and may mean different things to different people. And I argue in the book that this sort of shared political language that the revolution has provided us has essentially played a significant role throughout American history in shaping many of our most divisive and hard-fought conflicts. Now, for the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Great Britain and the Union of the States. And for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. The earliest exceptions to that were a few African American writers who actually grasped the power and utility of the preamble of the Declaration, were the first to do so. This is Lemuel Haynes, who was born in 1753 here in Connecticut to a white mother and a black father. And after completing a period of indentured servitude, he became a Minuteman and later participated in the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. Now, immediately after the Declaration became public knowledge, Haynes began connecting the Declaration with the cause of enslaved persons. And in a 1776 essay entitled Liberty Further Extended, he pointed out that there was then in the new states, quote, greater oppression than that which Englishmen seem so much to spurn at, an oppression which they themselves impose upon others. And then he went on to write that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage as equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. Now, Haynes later became an ordained congregational minister and was the first African American to preach to a white congregation in the United States. And as far as we can tell, he is one of the first Americans to quote the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and specifically its statement about human equality. And that makes him one of the first Americans to canonize equality as a principle of the revolution. And this change from a document about independence and union to one about liberty and equality really then begins in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. It really is the abolitionist movement that first defines the Declaration by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality. And in doing so, they created what I call the egalitarian declaration. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly reference the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator, which is one of the most prominent abolitionist newspapers of the era. And this is from 1831. And in introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison writes, assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. Abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. But this did not escape the notice of Southerners, as you can imagine. And then in a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, all men are created equal, as, quote, merely a rhetorical flourish. and blamed that phrase for the wild theories of liberty held by so many, basically meaning abolitionism. Now, in the hands of the abolitionists, the Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, a very seditious instrument. For them, the Constitution was the fundamental document that defined the Revolution, not the Declaration, and that is because the Constitution had been Southerners' best tool for protecting slavery. Garrison and his abolitionist followers actually came to agree with Southerners that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And as a result, they began to call for disunion because they argued slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises to slaveholders. And at a July 4th event in 1854 in Framingham, Massachusetts, Garrison famously pulled out of his pocket a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution, and then he called it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and set it on fire to a cheering crowd. Now, these two founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, were seen by both sides, abolitionists and pro-slavery Americans, as fundamentally different, as in direct opposition to one another, right? The radical Declaration and the more conservative Constitution, which established and maintained law and order and slavery. And so abolitionists and Southerners effectively fought over which document defined the Revolution, and by extension, the nation. And in some sense, abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. Right? In 1852, Frederick Douglass gives his famous speech in Rochester, New York, in which he asked, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" It was, he said, a day that reveals to him more than all days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim, and to him your celebration is a sham. Now, Douglass actually calls the signers of the Declaration brave and great men. He's not criticizing the founders. He's criticizing contemporary Americans in his time. He's criticizing those who would celebrate independence while ignoring the existence of slavery all around them. And that he called a hollow mockery of the Revolution. And what the abolitionists and Douglass had rendered very clear in the 1840s and 1850s was a new way for Americans to relate to the memory of the Revolution. The idea being that to celebrate the Revolution while doing nothing about unfreedom and inequality in the present was an insult to the founders and the revolutionary generation. For Douglass and abolitionists, the founding may have happened in 1776, but the Revolution was still going on. And until the ideals of the Declaration were fully realized, the Revolution would remain unfinished. Right? They give birth to this idea of the unfinished revolution that comes directly out of this new way of reading the Declaration, which is focused on the preamble and the ideals of liberty and equality. And in doing so, this turned the revolution from an event that had happened in the past into an ongoing struggle to more fully realize the nation's founding principles. And this idea of the unfinished revolution would go on to inspire countless social movements throughout American history, who also sought to more fully realize these ideals of liberty and equality for oppressed and marginalized groups. And so I'm going to give you a few examples of that. At the same time that the abolitionist movement is doing this, in the 1840s and 1850s, the women's rights movement, which is a forerunner of the suffragist movement, was fighting for the rights of married women. And that is because in many states, single and widowed women could own property and sign contracts and receive inheritances, but married women could not. And so in 1851, the National Women's Rights Convention declared this injustice, quote, as contrary alike to the principles of humanity and the Declaration of Independence. It was inconceivable, they argued, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the inalienable rights of only half of the human species. A later women's rights convention in New York City questioned, quote, "Is it not a principle of American law that no human being ought to be held responsible for a law to which they have not consented? Was that not the very principle of our revolution?" Now, the most famous expression of this movement and its relationship to the memory of the revolution is perhaps the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments from 1848, which essentially reproduces the Declaration of Independence, but with the preamble changed to include women, right? All men and women are created equal. And then they went on to substitute the grievances for their own list of grievances, which included overly restrictive divorce laws and the inability of women to work for themselves. So in the mid-19th century, we have the abolitionists and then the women's rights movements having a really profound impact on the Declaration's role in American political life and by extension, how the revolution was being remembered by many Americans. And by focusing on the preamble and the ideals of liberty and equality, they turned what was originally essentially a congressional PR document that was primarily aimed at helping secure foreign alliances into a statement of American principles yet unfulfilled. And this really gives birth to this notion of the unfinished revolution. Now, later in the 19th century, the National Women's Suffrage Association took advantage of the centennial anniversary in 1876 to promote their cause. And the leaders of the movement had petitioned the Centennial Commission for a place in the program on July 4th in front of Independence Hall, which you can see in the image there. But they were denied that request. And their hope had been to read their new Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States from the podium during the event. Even though they had been denied that request officially, on the day they were given seats behind the podium in a sort of reserve section, and they just waited until after the Declaration had been read, and then in the sort of hubbub between speakers, they rushed up to the podium and began handing out printed copies of this Declaration of Rights. And they caused such a stir at the event that people paid attention, and as they handed out copies to the crowd, people followed them as they made their way sort of off to the side to a small stage where Susan B. Anthony read this Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States. And in it, she wrote, "The history of our country this past 100 years has been a series of assumptions and usurpations of power over women in direct opposition to the principles of just government acknowledged by the United States at its foundation." So basically, they make the case that denying female suffrage was to deny the principles of the revolution, right? And they're drawing on this idea of the unfinished revolution because it is a violation of the founding principle of equality as canonized by the Declaration of Independence. Now, in the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement also drew heavily on the Declaration and this idea of the unfinished revolution. As early as 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. delivers a speech entitled "The Declaration of Independence and the Negro" before 1,600 people at a Jefferson Day rally at the University of Chicago. And in 1963, when he is jailed in Birmingham, in his famous letter from the jail, he is reacting to claims that he is an extremist, and he writes, "Was not Jesus an extremist for love? And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, 'We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.'" And he reminded his readers that African Americans had been equal contributors to the nation even before the Revolution. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, he wrote, "We were here." And he spoke of the great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in the Declaration of Independence. And most clearly, if we think back to King's speech at the March on Washington in August of 1963, where he famously describes the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note, right? That to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men black as well as white men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is directly drawing on this idea of the unfinished revolution. Now, with the bicentennial of 1976, subsequent civil rights movements by women and the gay and lesbian rights movements also tied their cause to the Declaration and the memory of the Revolution more broadly, and this idea of the unfinished revolution. So on July 4th, 1976, Karen DeCrow, who is the president of the National Organization for Women, she reread the speech that Susan B. Anthony had given, the document that had been passed in 1876, the Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States. And at a rally in Los Angeles, Jan Tucker, who was a member of the Peace and Freedom Party, told a reporter, quote, "We have to raise the issue this year that the American Revolution didn't just stop in 1776, that it is still going on." And then a little earlier, in the early 1960s, the Mattachine Society, which is a pioneering gay rights organization, declared that its goal was to, quote, "secure for the homosexual the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as proclaimed for all men by the Declaration of Independence." And here you can see a picture of a protest that they held in 1965 in front of Independence Hall, not long after the Congress on Racial Equality had held a similar protest in that same place. And the anniversary of the bicentennial provided sort of these newer movements for civil rights an opportunity to express not just their desire for equal rights, but their right to belonging in the nation. And they did this in part by drawing on the Declaration and this idea of the unfinished revolution. So in concluding, I want to make a point about this idea of the unfinished revolution and its relationship to our present moment. The ideals in the Declaration, in the preamble specifically, make this idea of the unfinished revolution possible. And I would argue that that idea of the unfinished revolution is actually one of the most powerful ideas in American history, because it has helped inspire and serve as a tool for many of our most important and successful social movements. And thereby it has helped achieve a more fully realized, though of course yet imperfect, vision of liberty and equality in the United States. The memory of the revolution, you can get a sense here, is not so much about history as it is about the present, right? And we can see that in some of these examples. And really no text, I would argue, has been more key in shaping how we remember the revolution than the Declaration, which has helped reinforce in our sort of civic identity a sense of aspiration and idealism. And that has undergirded our belief and commitment to a much broader notion of sort of national and civic progress. And that is why so many generations of Americans who dedicated their lives to achieving greater equality and freedom for all have used the Declaration to help voice and legitimize their goals. Now, this idea of the unfinished revolution and this long history that it has with the Declaration has been used by the marginalized, by the powerless, which is, I would argue, the history of that, of the way that the Declaration has been used since 1776 is just as important, if not more so, than the history of the Declaration in 1776. And that is because, one, it reveals the place of the Declaration in giving us this shared political language of terms like liberty and equality and tyranny. And it has sort of provided us with this sort of common lexicon that we have used for nearly 250 years to express our political beliefs and so to define our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, but also to express our sort of deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. And it's also important to know this longer history of the Declaration and this idea of the unfinished revolution as we engage with the 250th anniversary this year. This anniversary provides a really important platform, I believe, for us today to think about what these ideals mean to us in 2026 in our current context and circumstances. So what does liberty mean to us in 2026? What does equality mean to us in 2026? What does tyranny mean? What does resistance mean, right? And when you learn a little bit about this long history of the Declaration's place in American politics and culture, and this idea of the unfinished revolution, learning that history should empower us to decide the meanings of these ideas for ourselves, just like the many generations of Americans who have come before us have done for their own times. And when we do that, we become part of one of what I would argue is one of the most important and long-standing political traditions in American history of reimagining and the founding and making it relevant to us in the present. And when we do that, we are part of a tradition that goes back through the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, the suffragists, and all the way back to the abolitionists and Frederick Douglass. Thank you. We do questions? Yeah. Yeah.
This is a very stimulating talk, and I've read really a lot fairly recently about the influence of the statement, all men are created equal. Did that come as a great surprise to people in 1776? And was there much lead up in American thought or European thought?
Yeah.
Along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a book coming out on the Declaration of Independence later this year. And in that book, I argue that really nothing in the preamble would have been seen by Americans in 1776 as especially radical. If we think about, the idea of all men are created equal, most colonists, most white colonists, would have understood that phrase in the context of, their sort of antipathy toward aristocracy, right? Which of course Britain has, and this idea of a sort of hereditary hierarchy. So they would have understood equality in those terms, partly. They would have understood it also as expressing their belief in meritocracy, right? Which is that everybody has an equal opportunity to grow and achieve, achieve happiness or pursue happiness based on their own merits. And then also they would have understood that phrase as meaning or referring to equality before the law, right? Because during the imperial crisis of 65 to 1776, one of the main broader grievances that the colonists had was that they were not being treated the same as native-born subjects of Britain, right? They were being taxed in ways that native-born subjects of Britain would never be taxed. And so they believed that Parliament was treating them effectively as second-class subjects within the empire. And so this idea of equality before the law, they would have read that also from this phrase, all men are created equal. So really none of these ideas in the preamble were especially radical in 1776. It's what we have done with those ideas since that has made them radical, right? It's what the abolitionists did. It's what the women's rights movements did, what the suffragist movements did. They made these ideas radical. And, if we think about the Gettysburg Address, right, Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, where he draws on basically restates the preamble of the Declaration, he's often given what I think is way too much credit for changing how Americans thought about the Declaration, because in effect what he's really doing is he is just drawing on, this longstanding new memory of the Declaration by abolitionists and by the women's rights movements. When he talks in the Gettysburg Address about liberty and all men being created equal, he means it in the terms that the abolitionists did. And it's only in the decades after, as we sort of made school children have to memorize the Gettysburg Address, and in the post-Civil War period, that those ideas in the Gettysburg Address sort of became anodyne and lost their sense of radicality. But we make those ideas radical. Jefferson didn't do that. We did. Yeah. In the back. Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. The unfinished revolution in 250, which only took us 200 years.
Say again?
You stopped at 200.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in the last 50, especially the conservative attempt
Yeah.
to redefine what the Declaration meant and the whole concept of heritage Americans and all of that rhetoric.
Yeah.
And how does this fit into the arc that you've
Yeah.
discussed so far?
Okay, so the last section of the book basically covers from the bicentennial, at least until the end of the 20th century. And the story of the period after the bicentennial really is a continuation of two developments. One is early in the 20th century, liberals and progressives, Democrats, came up with a sort of, drew on the unfinished revolution as part of their way of relating to the revolution. And so they had a much more active sense of, and critical sense of patriotism. But conservatives in the early 20th century developed their own sense of patriotism, which is very much celebratory, right? And during the Cold War, conservatives do something that's actually quite impressive in the sense that I talked about how the Declaration and the Constitution were seen as being fundamentally different, right, and in conflict with one another. But it's conservatives during the early years of the Cold War in the 1950s who reconciled the Declaration and the Constitution for the first time. And they did that basically by coming up with a new reading of the Declaration, which I call the Libertarian Declaration, which is, instead of defining the Declaration by equality, they define it by the idea of liberty, and specifically individual liberty. That is pretty new, right? People in the 19th century did not really think about liberty in those terms. And so they had also developed a new way of thinking about the Constitution, which was the idea that the Constitution was defined by the principle of limited government, even though it was, the purpose of it was to create a more powerful government, right? But in doing that, they created a way to reconcile the Declaration and the Constitution, because they say, you know, by limiting government, by the Constitution limiting government, that is how you protect the individual liberty of the Declaration, right? And so really for the first time, they reconcile these two fundamentally different documents, and that is why that memory of the revolution as being about individual liberty and limited government became almost, by the end of the 1950s, it was the predominant memory of the revolution in the United States. And in many ways, I mean, many tens or maybe hundreds of millions of Americans still think about the revolution in that way, as being about individual liberty and limited government. And so the story of the post-1976 period is basically the continuation of those two different ways of thinking about the revolution. Like, so conservative, celebratory way of thinking about the revolution as individual liberty and limited government, and then you have, you know, the liberal way of thinking more about, you know, having a more active view of the revolution, this, the idea of the unfinished revolution, and also the goal of trying to expand the cast of characters in the popular memory of the revolution, right? And that has basically carried us down really to the present. You know, there hasn't been that significant of a change in the popular memory of the revolution on either side of the political spectrum really since the 1970s, It's just been continuing on those sort of two parallel tracks. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, as I see it too, the authors of both the Declaration and the Constitution were an exclusive club. They were educated much more than the general
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
And you even look at the laws of the Constitution, you couldn't vote unless you owned land.
Mhm.
So it wasn't an all-encompassing declaration. It was just for them themselves.
It is absolutely the case that they did not intend it to be interpreted as people after the 1830s would interpret it. That is for sure. But also, the elites, not just the elites who were in the Congress, but just the elites throughout the colonies, could not fight a revolution against Great Britain on their own. Right? They had to mobilize the broader population, right? And so, in some sense, these ideals in the Declaration and in the preamble, the way that they're understood in the 18th century, would have differed a little bit between how many elites viewed them and how ordinary Americans viewed them, right? And that's why the revolution unleashes a sort of new democratic spirit after the end of it. In the 1780s, we start to see, not just small landholders, but even merchants and sort of smaller shopkeepers who end up running for state legislatures and winning seats in state legislatures. So there is a sort of there is a degree of unintended consequences that that comes out of revolutions generally. But also, I would argue, just like revolutions have unintended consequences, so do memories of revolutions, right? They didn't intend for the preamble to be interpreted the way that we have come to interpret it. So, yeah, they didn't write it just for them, because they needed more people on their side to actually win the war. But they also did not anticipate how other Americans would interpret their words. Yeah. Yeah.
In your book on the bicentennial, you talk about the Cold War view of this revolution which had taken hold in America, and how that was played out in Nixon and Ford's bicentennial.
Yeah.
And how would you look at what's playing out with the semi-quincentennial, American 250 and Freedom 250, sort of what's at play there, if you care about it?
I think I shouldn't answer that, but I'm going to anyway, because I see a lot of similarities between the bicentennial and the present. In the book, I talk about not the bicentennial as being 1976, but as the long bicentennial era. I was born in 1975. When I was a kid in the early 80s, I still saw remnants of the bicentennial, chipped paint on red, white, and blue fire hydrants, knickknacks in people's houses that they had collected, And so the bicentennial had this much longer life than just 1976. And if we think about, I sort of date the beginning of the bicentennial era as from when the musical 1776 debuted on Broadway, right?
Or here at Stewart.
And that's right. And we might also think of the long 250 era as also starting with a musical opening on Broadway, right? With Hamilton in 2015. So there's that similarity. The bicentennial, just like the 1970s, was marked by no small amount of presidential scandal, right? I don't need to say more about that for the present. It was marked by a rather new and an unprecedented degree of distrust in public institutions, right? And so, which we also are experiencing today. It was marked by an economic downturn, right, which we are also experiencing today. I have found in working on this book that that we fight over the revolution more vehemently when certain conditions exist. So in times of like high political partisanship, we fight more about the meaning of the revolution. In times of economic downturns, we fight more about the memory of the revolution. In times of when there are prominent social movements, social justice movements, we fight more about the memory of the revolution. In times of high immigration or perceived higher immigration, we fight more about the revolution. And then also when a major anniversary is coming. And we have all of those right now. So we are at a sort of perfect storm, you know, for fighting about the meaning of the revolution. And we are going to see the current administration do, we're already seeing them do, what the Nixon administration tried to do in the 1970s with its Bicentennial Commission, which was, you know, to make the primary purpose of the anniversary useful to the political party of the administration, right, and the existing administration. And so we're already seeing that. There are all kinds of similarities also between the America 250 Commission and the ARBC, the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission, which had to be disbanded in scandal and corruption. But it's the same thing where they put a bunch of business leaders in charge of organizing a civic holiday, right? But one of the main differences that I would mention that I think is important is in the 1970s, the federal government put a lot of money behind the bicentennial. And a lot of that money ended up getting spread around in small grants to countless historical sites, local historical sites, and the bicentennial, as a result, the bicentennial actually was a transformative moment for public history in this country, especially for African American public history. Some of the first African American history museums come out of funding that came from the bicentennial. That is not the case this time, right? There is nowhere near the same amount of money behind the 250 as there was in the 1970s, and so we are unlikely to have either the best or the worst, you know, to repeat the best or worst parts of the bicentennial. So, yeah, Alan.
So I had a French father-in-law who in 1976 said, we in France, we had a real revolution, you know, we killed people, we had guillotine. He didn't, I mean, the American Revolution, what was revolutionary about it? He called it more of an
Bourgeois?
An evolution
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
Or more of a social revolution. So I guess the question is, was the breaking away from Britain, was that what was radical? Because if none of the ideas were radical or revolutionary, maybe we have to like rename it.
Well, I mean, in the 18th century, revolution did not mean what we think it means today, right? Revolution meant a return to something, right? A return to what they would have called first principles, right? The fact is that really, ever since the revolution ended, and this is what I talk about in my first book, as soon as the revolution ended, there was an effort by elites to de-radicalize the revolution, right? Because you can't constantly be in a revolutionary spirit, right? That does not lend itself to stability, right? And so in a lot of the earliest histories written about the revolution, you know, they focus on a few prominent individuals. They don't give as much significance as we do now to what they would have thought of as mob actions, like the Boston Massacre or the Tea Party, the Stamp Act riots. So they really tried to de-radicalize the revolution so that to try to tamp down the sort of democratic spirit that was unleashed by the event. And that really, that's a trend that has continued throughout American history and became especially important during the 20th century because of the Russian Revolution. I would argue that the Russian Revolution was probably the most important event in the 20th century in shaping how we remember the American Revolution, right? Because when the Cold War came, Americans had to define themselves in opposition to the Soviet Union. And this is why that Cold War conservative memory that I was describing was so effective. Individual liberty was in direct contrast to collectivism, right? Limited government of the Constitution was in direct contrast to the Soviet bureaucracy, right? And the third ideal that I didn't mention is free trade or capitalism, which of course is in direct contrast with socialism and essentially planned economy. So we have, during the Cold War, we had to not just define ourselves in contrast to the Soviet Union, but to do it in a way because the Soviet Union was perceived as the radical ones, right? So we defined our revolution in much more conservative terms. And it's always been contrasted with the French Revolution. I mean, even in the early 19th century, historians write about contrasting those two events because the French Revolution was a really highly determinant factor in early national politics, depending on which side you were on in the French Revolution. So yeah, it's how we view the American Revolution in relation to the French Revolution has which is to say that it's always been defined by present circumstances, right? Which is the case for all of the entire memory of the revolution, but especially how those two are contrasted. Anybody else? No? No? Back here, one more?
Yes. If we were to say that we were now in a different version of that sort of Campbell cycle, but not, I mean, something more in the direction of authoritarianism, say, than in the direction of liberation, where would you place us right now, and what direction do you think? I mean, do you think we can make some kind of mapping like this, but that actually depicts where we're going, which is so much the opposite of where the original revolution was?
I'm a historian, so I can't predict the future. But I will tell you that in the 18th century, as part of the Enlightenment, Scottish thinkers came up or developed an older idea from ancient writers about how history played out. And their idea was that history was cyclical, not linear, the way that we think about it. And so what would happen is you would have societies or empires, they would inevitably rise and fall, right? And when they were young and hungry, they would be virtuous and care more about the concern for the common good and be very frugal. And then as they accumulated wealth and power, they would become concerned more with their own self-interest than the common good, and they would become very sort of profligate and wasteful, and then that would mark the beginning of their inevitable downfall, right? So history would go in an endless cycle, up and down. And I once taught a class on the Enlightenment at Knox College, and I described this cyclical view of history to the students, and I drew a diagram of it on the board. And I asked them where they thought we were at in that cycle. And it was a small class. There was only 6 students in it. And they all put us in a different spot. 2 of them actually thought we were still on the way up. So I have no way of answering your question in a objective or authoritative way, But I think we all need to think for ourselves, where are we on that cycle? And the idea behind that has always been that you can stave off the inevitable decline. You can sort of temporarily forestall it by returning to your first principles. And that is also why the memory of the revolution has been so important, right, in our politics and our culture. I mean, the Tea Party, if we think about the Tea Party from the 2010s, is kind of an expression of that, right? But it's something that runs throughout our history. And if you think about liberty and equality as first principles of the nation, then, returning to those first principles, and I would argue redefining them for the present, may help us temporarily forestall our inevitable decline. All right, one more. Rob.
You're talking about a lot about the preamble to the Declaration. But it strikes me that events of the last couple of years have breathed new life into the list of accusations against the king, to the point that it's almost like you feel like people in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue are going through the document, checking them off one by one as they implement them. Is that something you might want to address in the Declaration?
That book is written. There is a book coming out. I can't remember the title right offhand. It's by Rob Parkinson. And it is specifically about the grievances section. There are a shocking number of grievances that are relevant to the present, right? Not least the grievance that blamed the king for limiting immigration into the colonies, right? Which was super important to growing the colonial population. I was in Concord for the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord last year. And, there were large protests there, the No Kings protests, right? And the revolution was not a revolution against monarchy. There's nothing in the Declaration that says monarchy is inherently bad. It says George III is not a good monarch, right? And that's why we need to get away from him. Thomas Paine said monarchy was bad, but there's nothing in the Declaration saying that. The revolution was not a revolution against monarchy itself, right? But that is a popular misconception because the Declaration the grievances mention George III. They don't mention Parliament. And the reason for that is because over the course of the previous, 7 or 8 years, most Americans had decided that Parliament had no jurisdiction over them, right? And so that by the time that you get to 1776, the last political band that is connecting them to the empire is through the king. And that's why all those grievances are addressed to the king, not Parliament, even though some of them describe parliamentary actions, right? But that fact has made it so that we have often misread the Declaration as this anti-monarchical document, right? Which it is not. And the revolution was not an anti-monarchical revolution. That said, so in a sense, the No Kings protests, I would say, well, that's really not historically accurate. But I would also say, as a historian of memory, I don't care, right? Because historical memories do not rely on factual accuracy to be successful or to be powerful. They draw on your previously held beliefs, right? They draw on your emotions, right? Nobody ever came to learn about the revolution with no political beliefs and then took all their political beliefs from what they learned about the revolution, right? It's usually the other way around. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but these memories draw on what we already have. We bring our preconceived notions to them. And so how they get used and how successful they are has no bearing really on how historically accurate they are. And I thought that the No Kings protests and that the framing pulled down my emotions, You know, so like, it's, to my mind, that was a successful example of the use of the memory of the revolution in the present. Even though it's not historically accurate, it's politically useful. And the memory of the revolution should be nothing else if not politically useful. And that is the story of my book. So thank you, everyone, for coming.